Okay, guys, here I am again, Tamara Hart Heiner, ready to read to you from Episode 5, Dictionary Troubles, from the Epic Misadventures of Caden Parker, Old High Knights, Year 1, age 10. Chapter 1, Deliberate Pain. A sword. A real, live, metal sword. Caden Parker sat cross-legged on the top of the bunk bed in the room he shared with Jack. In front of him lay a sword, a real metal sword. He had asked for one for Christmas. Never in a million years had he thought he would actually get one. But his dad had gone out to a pawn shop in Fayetteville and bought him a sword. Not only had he gotten a guitar for Christmas, he'd gotten a sword, like Excalibur itself. It came with some rules, of course. Mr. Parker said the edges were dull, so it wouldn't injure like a sharp sword, but it could still hurt. Caden was not allowed to play swords with his brother and sister. He wasn't allowed to stab the dog, and he wasn't allowed to cut anyone. So mostly he just sat and admired it, the way he was now. Caden! He startled at his brother's voice and tried to wrap the sword up before he was spotted staring at it again, but he wasn't fast enough. Jack pushed his head over the edge of the bunk bed, looping his arms around the frame. A grin stole across his face when he saw the sword. Is that all you're going to do? Admire the thing? There's nothing else I can do with it, Caden said, a bit incensed. Jack had a mischievous sparkle in his eye. He didn't get them often, as Jack was more prone to follow all the rules, but when he did, Caden knew he had to watch out. Come on, Jack said. Let's play swords just for a few minutes. Dad's not home. He won't even know. Caden wasn't even tempted. No way. Dad said he'll take the sword away from me. But he didn't say he would take it away from me, Jack said. How about I use the real sword and you can use my plastic one? That didn't sound much better. Now, instead of Caden accidentally hurting someone, he was likely to be the one hurt. Jack shrugged and pushed off the bed frame. It's probably too heavy for you anyway. It is not, Caden said, lifting the sword up with one hand. So you can lift it. You can't carry it for long. You certainly can't fight with it. This wasn't true. Caden had spent almost an hour the day before out on the driveway, parrying and thrusting against an invisible enemy. I can lift the sword for an hour. Prove it. Jack opened the closet door and pulled out a long plastic sword. Play swords with me. Just for 10 minutes. If it were anyone else, Caden would think they were setting him up for trouble. But Jack wasn't manipulative like that. Fine, he said, relenting. Just for 10 minutes. He managed not to show the sudden excitement at the thought of using his sword. He hopped off the bed, carrying the weapon with him, even though it was almost as tall as he was. We can't plan here, Jack said. The room is too small. Let's go downstairs. But we'll be seen, Caden said. No, we won't. Mom's in the basement doing laundry. Just come on already. Jack was starting to sound impatient. Caden obliged, following him down the hall, downstairs, and into the living room. On guard, Jack hollered, immediately stepping into a fighting stance. Apparently, Caden wasn't the only one who had been practicing his sword-fighting moves. He lifted the metal sword, grunting a little bit. It was heavier than expected, maybe because he was trying to lift it to the same height as the sword Jack whirled around. A look of envy crossed Jack's face as the two swords collided, the plastic one bending and folding over on itself as the metal clashed into it. Can I try yours? Jack asked. Caden hesitated. It was his sword, his new sword. But Jack would share. It took a monumental effort, but Caden held out his sword to his older brother. It might be too heavy for you, he said. Jack laid it next to his hip, then dragged it slowly across his torso as if removing it from a scabbard. He heaved it high into the air and shouted, On me! Caden picked up the plastic sword Jack had abandoned and swung it across his brother's back. Ow, Jack said, but Caden hardly heard him. He dropped the plastic sword and let out a holler of pain, doubling over and clutching his hand in his other fist. Jack turned around and gave him a bewildered look. What's wrong? Caden dropped to the ground, groaning as he squeezed his hand. Heat pulsed in his finger, radiating like a throbbing heartbeat through his knuckle. He lay back on the floor. I broke my finger! You did? Now Jack looked alarmed. How? Boys? Caden froze at the sound of their mother's voice. From downstairs, he heard her footsteps emerging from the laundry room. Did someone scream? She called. Caden met Jack's eyes and hissed as loudly as he dared. Hide my sword! Jack raced into the guest bedroom with the sword. He returned a minute later with no sword, just as Mrs. Parker reached the top of the stairs and stepped into the living room. Her eyes swept over Caden on the floor and then turned to Jack. "What happened to your brother?" Jack shook his head. "It wasn't me." Caden moaned loudly and said again, "I broke my finger! It's broken!" Mrs. Parker crossed the room and crouched beside Caden, taking his hand in her own. "What happened, boys? You tell me now." Caden's eyes shot to his brother. If Jack mentioned Caden's real sword... He hit me in the back with the sword and hurt his finger," Jack blurted. "With your new sword, Caden?" she said sharply, but Jack waved the limp plastic one. "No, this one." "Good thing it wasn't the other one." Mrs. Parker stopped her administrations over Caden's finger and looked at Jack. "He hit you? And hurt his finger?" Jack bobbed his head vigorously, eyes wide. Caden could only groan. His mom took his fingers between her own and pinched them. Caden yelped when she touched the afflicted one. "Well, it's not broken." Caden thought he detected laughter in her words. "But I think it is jammed. There's probably going to be a bruise." Definitely chuckling now, she stood up. "I'll get some ice." "What's so funny?" Caden grumbled, his eyes following her to the kitchen. "Nothing." "Well, I guess it is something. Usually one of you gets in trouble for hurting the other. But this time you hurt yourself while trying to hurt someone else." Jack laughed too, but Caden didn't see the humor in it. All right, that's all I will read from episode 5, Dictionary of Troubles. See you next week.